Welcome to Scene Change, a podcast by the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division. All about equality, opportunity, accessibility, and the arts. Here, you'll learn adaptive techniques from performers in the know. We are changing what it means to be blind, one stage at a time. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Scene Change. I'm Lizzy Muhammad Park, your host, and today's episode just might be one of my favorites, which I know I'm guilty of saying a lot, but our goal of connecting with people of varying disabilities has finally come to fruition. We have concert violinist Rachel Barton Pine joining us today. Welcome to the show, Rachel.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Oh, so glad to have you. So before we begin, I need to give a huge shout out to the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division's own Leslie Hamrick for connecting us. Leslie was featured on our December 2020 episode. And of course, that can be found wherever you receive your podcasts. And if you stay tuned to the end of this show, you'll hear a bonus interview with Leslie about her current work and her work with Rachel. But Rachel will probably tease some of that for us today. Now, here's a bit of an introduction for you all. Rachel has been described as a dazzling concert violinist. She was featured in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and NPR's Tiny Desk, which I am a huge fan of. She's released loads of albums and is fire on social media. We'll get into all of that throughout the interview. But first, Rachel, would you begin by a little bit about your disability? And I asked this question because you are our first full episode of a guest who has a disability that is not blindness. So whatever you'd like to share with us.
So one of the things that I intellectually understood about disability, but didn't truly appreciate until, personal experience really made it more visceral, is just the fact that you can move in and out of different levels of being, typical or less typical, just throughout your life journey. Now, I guess this could be, this could be equally true for other categories, whether it's gender, sexual orientation. Some things are mutable, some things are immutable. Is that the right word?
Mm-hmm.
Like one's, genetics of racial and ethnic background, but disability, I think perhaps, more than any other is something where, one day you can be perfectly typical and the next day you can be injured or have an illness or any of those kinds of things. And it's also something that any one of us could enter, unexpectedly at any moment. We don't like to think about that, right? We walk down the street and don't want to think that, there could be a car accident or something like that. But the truth, that's the reality we live in. And so anyways, in terms of me, I lived a normal life, quote unquote, in terms of my physicality up until just after I turned 20, when I was injured just due to corporate negligence by a railroad. And then I lost one limb above the knee, and then the other was severely damaged and, had a long recovery. I was able to resume walking to a certain degree, initially with assistive devices like a walker and then crutches. I was sitting to perform. And then this is actually really fun. I could talk about this perhaps at some point, but I, didn't think I would ever be able to stand and play my violin again, because the effort that it took to keep my balance while standing was negatively impacting my violin playing. And so the number of hours it would have taken to get used to playing the violin would have kind of warped my playing. So I thought it was, an impasse. But then I started playing electric violin, and that's what I could talk about later. That's not my main thing, but it's certainly a fun sideline. And that instrument, it's just a different art form, and there's not a level of refinement that's quite as intense as with an acoustic violin. And so, standing to play that instrument, I was able to get used to having a violin and being on my feet, and then finally I, sort of found my balance and then was able to pick up the acoustic violin and still sound like myself and do that. And so that was really interesting to go from standing to sitting and then back to standing. And then I thought that was going to be, how I would live the rest of my life until, perhaps seniorhood, when all of us start to
Right,
get
right.
it. But unexpectedly, then in fall, well, December of 2018, I had a knee infection, which ultimately led to a whole series of medical things and a period of lack of care during COVID, which, it was sad for me, but I always think to myself, at least I wasn't one of those people who couldn't get their cancer treatments during COVID or whatever. But the
Mm,
result, um, is that unexpectedly, I was told by my doctors that because I couldn't get the care that I had needed, that I would now never be able to walk again, or at least, not until some technology exists that doesn't currently exist. Some invention gets invented at some unknown point in the future. But based on what exists now in the, best hospitals in the world, they said I will never walk again. And that, even from the time that I was injured in January of 95, I had at least been able to stumble around to some degree, more or less, sometimes better, sometimes worse. But now I've become completely non-ambulatory, which is a category that, as I said, I never expected to be in, at least not until the end of my life, perhaps. And so
right,
that's been really eye-opening because, of course, for me, it's, due to, bone and tissue issues and things like that. But for so many people, there's so many different reasons why you might be non-ambulatory, whether it's a disease, whether it's paralysis, so many different ways that that might happen. And it's, despite being a disabled person, I just had never put myself in well, the expression is in the shoes, but in the wheels of somebody who couldn't walk. And, just kind of realizing that, the lack of a curb cut is an impassable barrier, or that you have to always think about where is the next restroom located because, you can't get into a stall unless it's specially designed for you. And so if you're out to,
right,
or if you're traveling, you always have to have that in the back of your mind, like, kind of planning it out. And, even getting into different buildings, like, is there going to be a ramp? Is there going to be enough space between tables for me to navigate this restaurant? All of those things. So I feel like it's really opened my eyes to, what others go through,
hmm
and also just made me think about how there are all of these other categories of different things that people deal with. And, I had a vague awareness of, of course, there are people who are deaf, there are people who are blind, there are people who are neurodivergent, there are all these different categories of people who are not what you would consider to be typical. But I've been just living my life and, doing my advocacy for music education and, kind of existing despite my disability, but not really thinking about it. But this has kind of forced me to think about it. I
hmm
guess the other thing that was unexpected was I was listening to one of your other episodes and someone was talking about passing. And that really resonated
mm,
because, there are, prejudices and assumptions and discrimination built into our society. And, in order to live a successful professional life, you have this feeling like, well, I don't want to cause extra, um, what's the right word? Just, well, extra annoyance or extra work for the person hiring
right,
me to have to have me as the person that they hired. And then when they're thinking of who do they want to invite back, maybe they think, well, we liked this person and we liked this person, but this one was easier. So you always want to be as easy as possible so that you can get those return invitations. And so I did a lot of, just pretending I was doing better than I was. And Of course, well, maybe that's the wrong way to put it. Of course, when I was on stage and, doing my thing, I was doing great. But behind the scenes,
Right.
I only had, so many steps per day that my skin, that my body could tolerate. Because, the limb loss, like people can go and live an incredibly active life with limb loss with great prosthetics, but it was the damaged other side, with the 50 surgeries
That's
and and that's what people, don't talk about as much or might not have seen. So, yeah, so that, there's
wow.
limitation. So, like, literally, I would be sitting on my hotel bed and I would need something from across the room, and I would wait till I needed three things so that then I would do those, couple of yards over to the counter to grab those three things. And now
Mm,
to my steps doing three journeys of a few yards each. Like that's how kind of microscopic I was planning my days. And I'm not complaining. I mean, I
no.
do it. It became my normal, but it certainly wasn't anything that I talked about openly because I didn't want the perception of the industry to be like, okay, this person is different and therefore, have any questions in their mind as to whether that could potentially compromise my ability to carry out my professional duties.
Right.
And
Oh
sometimes
my
I would
goodness,
have
it's true.
yeah, and sometimes I would have to overdo it. I would end up
Hmm.
hours and then I would have to take a couple days off where I didn't leave my apartment until things healed up. And yeah, thank goodness for internet groceries. And but of course, it curtailed my social life. And yeah, so it was a challenging existence. And the ironic thing is now I have no choice but to be open. Like clearly I'm in an electric scooter and everybody can see that I'm in an electric scooter and the life that I'm living and the life that I'm being perceived to be living are actually in alignment for the first time. And in a way, that's kind of freeing and relaxing, even though, of course, the challenges are in some ways now quite a bit, quite a great deal greater. But I also do feel like 10 years ago, you know, before I mean now there's all this pushback against DEI, like, why would anybody, be against inclusion? That doesn't even make sense. But 10 years ago, before that was even part of the wider conversation, I feel like, people might have been a bit more grumpy about having to make sure that they, figured out which entrance I should go in when I got to the hall or things like that. And now, even with the pushback, I feel like people's eyes have been opened and they're not going to close again so quickly, and people actually, I've been pleasantly surprised by how, kind of welcoming and matter of fact and gracious and just that there really hasn't been any problem with me continuing to do what I do and seeming to be continued to be someone that people want to invite. So I'm very relieved and grateful for that, because that's, I think, what we all want. We want to be judged on our merits. I don't want somebody to hire me to do a concert because I can't walk, because then I wouldn't feel like I deserved that concert. But I don't want somebody to decide not to hire me because they think they're going to have an issue with the fact that I can't walk. I just want, if somebody likes my music, I'm happy to come and play for them. And that's the life that I've always led and hope to continue leading as long as I can.
That's what it's all about. It's about the music, and that's what this show is all about, is really emphasizing that point. I like what you said earlier about finding your balance, because finding your balance is it's so much more. We're finding our balance in so many ways in life. And for you, you were doing so physically, but you were also doing so as you recalibrated and got to know what your new normal would be like, i.e., life with a disability. You mentioned limb loss, you mentioned wheelchair use, scooter use. There are just so many variables to this. Um, you also discussed professional work as a musician with a disability, and that actually segues very nicely into my next question because the world of disability can be, not that it is, but it can be very isolating, specifically for professionals. Um, but you've done a really nice job of creating space for people of varying disabilities to collaborate and connect and get together. And that was through your accessibility, I got to get this right, accessibility spotlight campaign. Would you be able um, to share with our listeners sort of what sparked that for you? And of course, what was it like doing it? How did it turn out? Just anything you'd like to share regarding that campaign on social media.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I can tell you who's on there thus far, and we have a lot more people on our wish list, and we're constantly discovering more people. But another violinist, Adrian Antonuan, was our first spotlight, and he's so amazing because he's been working in this space of awareness and advocacy for so many years. He's so articulate. I feel like I'm just starting out and really looking to him for guidance and inspiration. But he is missing an up part of one of his arms, and there was a special device created for him to be able to use his bow on his violin, and he ended up going to a top conservatory. He's not an average player, not that there's anything wrong with that, but he's actually technically a virtuoso player, which is really amazing. And he can't hide. I mean, you look at him and you see his disability front and center, but yet if you close your eyes and listen to his music, he just sounds like, a gorgeous violinist who's really going to move you with his playing. And so, yeah, he's an amazing guy. And then Kinetic Light Dance group, they are wheelchair dancers who are, so incredibly creative. And one of the things that I really admire about them is, every space that they go into to perform, they actually advise the space on how to not just temporarily rig it up for them for that one night, but how to more permanently alter their space so that it can be a more welcoming environment for audiences and performers. And they even have things like they have special you think dance is all about looking at the dancers, right? It's not like music where you can just listen, but they actually have special descriptive tracks that they make so that people who are blind can still go to their dance concerts and listen to the music and hear on the track what the performers are doing on stage. They have special accommodations for people who have different neurodivergent issues. I mean, it's really amazing how they've thought beyond themselves and their own category to make their concerts as inclusive as possible. And then, of course, the great Itzhak Perlman, who I grew up as a tiny child watching on TV and admiring as one of the greatest violinists ever to have lived. But, he happens to be post polio and, used to walk with crutches and sit down to perform. And now is in a electric scooter, just like me. Actually, he's the one that advised me on what brand to get back in the day. But yeah, of course, Maestro Perlman is on there. And then Dame Evelyn Glennie, who is the deaf percussionist, who's one of the greatest percussionists in the world, but experiences what the sounds that she's making through vibrations. And then your friend Leslie, and most recently Amy Wang Hiller, who is another violinist with EDS, which is really interesting condition to have to navigate in the world. And yeah, I mean, it's not a competition, but no matter how what challenges any of us might have, we can always think of somebody with greater challenges. And EDS is certainly pretty high up there in the spectrum of possible challenges. So, and she's nonetheless, living a great life and making beautiful music. So, yeah, so I guess, the reason I was so curious to kind of find different people and learn more about them was just because despite having been disabled since 95, it was only, well, not even in 2018, 2019, because I always thought I was going to get back to how I was. So I wasn't fully experiencing how I currently was because I thought it was temporary. And, so it wasn't until 2021 when I received, my unexpected news. that, I suddenly felt like, I was in this different category than I'd ever been in all those previous years. Like, well, I don't want to do the math, but 95 to 2021, that's a long time. What is that? 26 years. So after 26 years, suddenly I felt like I was in this whole other category of disability. And as I said, it was such a different kind of disability that it opened my eyes to this other category. And then I thought, well, there's so many more categories. And it just made me curious because I felt like I was learning so much. I wanted to learn more.
That's another excellent segue into my next question, which is how did you learn about disability rights and raising awareness for the disabled community? Because you know a lot of people.
Yeah, well, Chicago, of course, is a rich city in so many ways, whether it's our multiple music scenes with every genre you can think of, or our beautiful architecture, just the friendliness of everybody, but the sophistication of our museums and our cultural life. I mean, and we have a gorgeous lake and river, and I'm in love with Chicago. I could never imagine living anywhere else. And Chicago is also home to an organization called Access Living, which is a nationally important advocacy organization. Of course, on the local level, they do all kinds of things helping people with housing and with legal representation, and they made Wrigley Field improve their bathroom situation, and things. I mean, it's from the societal down to the personal, but also on the national level they were very, very involved with all of the work that finally led to the passage of the ADA. And in fact, if you go over there, they have early voting on one of their rooms, and lining the entire room. Just if you go along the wall from one wall to the next, all the way around the room, they have the story of the passage of the ADA in pictures. And it was a civil rights movement, every bit as powerful as any of the other historic civil rights movements. And you know we stand on the shoulders of those who went before. I happen to be female, and all the women who fought for hundreds of years for women's rights. I happen to be white, but with my work since 2001 with my foundation's Music by Black Composers project, I'm very, very aware of civil rights for different racial groups and all of those movements. And so, of course, the disability rights is one more, just amazing effort by, the marginalized of society to stand up for themselves, and gain allies, and, not quit until they achieved their objectives. And as with feminism or racism or, any of the other issues, plaguing our society, the work is not over. There's still so much more to be done. And, I can't be thankful enough to those who are really on the front lines of continuing to fight every day, for things to improve for everyone.
You have the Music by Black Composers Project, as well as several other initiatives that you do, providing music and strings to people in various countries or of lower income, things like that. You have these different initiatives to assist people in achieving equality. Um, so could you just briefly share some of that with our audience, in case there's anyone out there who may qualify for one of your grants or initiatives that your nonprofit does?
Yeah, so thanks for asking about my foundation. So the Rachel Barton Pine Foundation was started in 2001, and it was really a way to give back for the help that I had received as a student. I grew up in a very financially struggling household where my father was unemployed for most of my childhood until eventually abandoning the family, and my mom was trying to raise me and my two younger sisters, and it was always very tenuous, like how will we be able to pay for gas to put in our car to drive to my lessons in the suburbs with the the best teacher that I need to study with, and then also have enough money to buy groceries that week. And our phone and electricity were always getting cut off. And it was, because music scholarships might pay for your lessons, but they're not going to pay for the gas to drive to your lessons. They're not going to pay for your instrument. So I relied on borrowed instruments. They're not going to pay for concert clothes or your audition recording sessions or piano accompanist fees, even to purchase the sheet music that you're supposed to learn next. So all of those things, we relied on extended family, help from our church, but it was really, really touch and go, and it almost seemed, super illogical for me to have the not only the dream that I wanted to be of professional violinist, but also the belief that this is what I was meant to do with my life. And yet, all these constant obstacles. And so, I wanted to help other young musicians. There are lots of scholarships out there, there are competitions out there, but the person that lives that wins the competition that day might be somebody from a very well-off family. And, the scholarships, again, they pay for lessons, but not for the gas. So, my program was really to support kids who qualified or young artists starting out their early stages of their career, basically that fit three criteria. One, that they were, I don't like to use the word talent because talent will only get you so far. It's hard work that gets you your skills going. But someone who was very accomplished for their age, someone who was in great financial need, and someone who intended to make a life in music. Because if they're planning to go to pre-med and love violin, there are only so many dollars to go around, and we want to support the person who's planning to actually be a professional in music. So, of course, there are lots of wonderful programs that support, aspiring young musicians just starting out. But we felt that it would be important to, really fill this underserved niche of the young artists who are very, very accomplished but can't afford all of the things that they need to get their dreams going. So, and we also have an instrument loan program, and we've been really blessed to have supported more than 100 young artists at this point, and just make that difference. So it looks like, when is 100% scholarship not enough? So it's something that a lot of people, I think, aren't aware of unless they themselves have grown up in that kind of a circumstance. And then the Music by Black Composers Project was just another result of living here in Chicago. We have a wonderful organization called Center for Black Music Research, and various performing arts groups that focused on that slice of the repertoire long before it was embraced by mainstream classical music as a whole. And so, just because I happen to have grown up in this city, I happen to have been aware of this repertoire much earlier than most of my peers of my generation, including most of my African American peers. And so I made an album in 97 called Violin Concertos by Black composers from the 18th and 19th centuries. Of course, violin concertos from the 1700s and 1800s. We're not talking African American composers, because no American composers of any race were writing violin concertos in the 1700s. These were Afro-European and Afro-Caribbean composers. And I made the project literally because I loved the music and I was so excited to discover it. I liked the fact that it was awesome violin music that hadn't been in the mainstream of music that people knew. And so it was really more of a just being passionate about the music itself, and naively at the age of, I think, 22, not really realizing the impact that it would have, kind of socially. But then after the album came out, I started getting so many requests from students and parents and teachers to have more of this music to support their studies and their connection with classical. And I realized that the wonderful work that was being done in academia to dig up the composers and the history, like the all-black orchestras of America of the 1800s that were the equivalent of the Negro baseball leagues, or the fact that Coretta Scott King and Booker T. Washington were serious violinists. All of this history was known to geeks like me who read academic journals for fun, but not the average, family in the average town who might feel like classical music is somebody else's music. So, as someone who's, very, very passionate about um, music education and inclusion in classical music, I wanted to create materials specifically targeted for pedagogical use. And so much of the repertoire, these wonderful compositions, were long out of print, or even never published in manuscript only due to historical discrimination. So it took us 15 years of gathering more than 900 pieces from four centuries from around the world, and then sorting through them. And then we finally released our first violin volume, and then we have um, three more volumes, and we have a flute volume that's come out now and works for pianos, and just all kinds of different resources that are free on our website. Um, that, gosh, and now that I'm talking to you, I'm thinking, I wonder how any of this is accessible to blind people. And maybe I can, after this interview, ask you for a recommendation. I don't know if there are people within your network who consult, um, so that I could, be taught, told like, okay, what tweaks can I make to improve this website for people who might be wanting to access it and would need something a little bit different.
Oh, there absolutely are. Yes.
Yeah.
We'll connect you with some of those consultants.
And actually, not to pivot, but
Mhm.
now that I'm thinking about, sort of that category, one of the things that I started doing recently was making audio tracks of my CD album liner notes. A lot of times I write the essays myself. Sometimes a musicologist who's a specialist in that, in whatever it is that I recorded, might be invited to do it instead. But a lot of times I know enough that I feel like I want to write the essay. And then I always write a personal note that talks about, why did I choose this repertoire? What are my feelings about it? What's my history with it? Why do I love it? All that kind of thing. And I realize that more and more people are listening to streaming only. And we're talking about completely typical humans, but they're listening to things on streaming. One of my record companies, Cedille Records, with whom I've made the majority of my albums, has an unusually um, useful website where they actually print, or they post PDFs of every single one of their booklets from every single one of their albums, so that if you don't have the physical CD in hand, you can still go to the album booklet and you have the entire thing right there. Um, but not everybody's going to go and do it or knows that that exists. And so I thought, well, isn't this sad? Because for classical music, it's not, well, even pop stars like to talk about, what does this song mean and stuff like that. But for classical, when we're dealing very often with a lot of historical music, it does add something to the listening experience to know, who was the composer, what was their life story, what was going on when they wrote this piece, what's special about this piece, all of that kind of historic information. I mean, good music can, exist on its own, and you can just listen to it for the melodies and the emotions and enjoy it even if you don't know any of that stuff. But I think it's really fun to know that extra information. And so I thought, what am I going to do about the fact that all of these people are now, I mean, not that they necessarily read it when they had the CD in hand, but at least you had a fighting chance, right? So I decided, because I listen to a lot of audiobooks. That's my thing when I'm like putting on my makeup to go on stage or folding the laundry. Um, there are other kinds of things that I do where I listen to music, but I have specific daily tasks where I listen to audiobooks. And I thought, why don't I turn my CD booklets into an audiobook? And so the last few albums, I've now started recording an extra track that goes on the streaming version of the album, which is me speaking the entirety of the album booklet. And it was only after I got that idea, that I realized, wait, this might actually also be useful for blind people who couldn't read the album booklet even if they were holding it in their hands. So that was actually what got me started thinking about blind people and classical music. And, can they read the concert program? And should concert series be doing more to provide audio program notes, that you can access before a performance? And, what about my biography? If they want to know, my um, details of my life journey, that's printed in that biography in the program, and they can't see that printed version. And, so there's a lot to do. There's a lot of well, gosh, it's a funny analogy or funny expression to use, but a lot of opening of eyes. Do you guys use that metaphorically?
Oh
Um,
yeah. Yeah, we use everything. Watch TV, it opened my eyes, all of it.
yeah,
See you tomorrow,
I
all
still
of it.
say
I
I still
know.
say I'm gonna walk over to pick up, the groceries, even though I'm literally not walking. Like
Oh yeah, I
those
know, right?
expressions
Yeah.
are still
Yeah, we use
so baked into our society.
exactly, exactly. At this point, it's just a cultural reference, you know what I mean? Um, Speaking of all of this, one of the things that you might find interesting and probably just fascinating to do on our show, if there's someone who plays an instrument that is not as commonly known, or even if it is a common instrument, we like to have the artist describe it. Now, on Leslie's episode, she already described the violin, but you mentioned earlier about the electric violin, and
Yeah,
I'd love for you to just describe it and how just describe it as using the violin as a point of reference, if that makes sense. So I don't know,
totally.
does it
Totally.
have a chord or you know what I mean? Yeah, just whatever you can tell us about that.
Yeah, so first of all, when it comes to like normal acoustic violins, um, a lot of people have an expertise where they can look at the scroll, that's the curvy part, that's really purely decorative at the end of the little box where the tuning pegs stick in, which is at the end of the fingerboard. And people can look at the scroll and say, oh, that looks like it was made by this maker from the 1700s versus that maker from the 1700s. And then also the sound holes, which are kind of in the shape of a curly F. People can say the cut of the F holes. To me, honestly, a scroll looks like a scroll. I can't tell one from another. Um, but the sound box of a violin, which I know is based on like Fibonacci sequences, and it was in the violin family of instruments was in its various sizes was invented around the 1490s, and the motivation for it is that consorts of instruments in various sizes, mimicking, the blend of human voices. So we're talking about like, little, medium, big recorders, or some of those other types of wind instruments from the Renaissance and from the medieval. Those instruments were basically provided a lot of music for court settings, whether it was dance music, background music, sometimes concert music. And so Isabel d'Este, as a woman ruler, really felt like the military and phallic associations of these wind instruments were not appropriate for the court of a lady. But thus far, the existing medieval stringed instruments had never been made in families. So she commissioned the best instrument makers to come up with this idea of this set of instruments. And it was right at the birth of this new instrument, the violin, which I'm not going to get into all the details of how it stole various characteristics from various of its ancestors and then combined them to make this perfect new instrument. But from the very beginning, the characteristics of its construction were so perfect that it's literally never been improved upon. The violin has existed as it is for more than half a millennium, which is incredible. But change in art doesn't mean improvement. It just means different. We wouldn't say that all the painters of the 1800s are better than all the painters of the 1700s, and all the painters of the 2000s are better than any of the ones that came before. It's just a different kind of human expression, and music as it evolves is also just, you know, I mean, when we think about music, it's of its time, but the best of it is timeless, and instruments as well. So, but the one thing about acoustic violins is they can be incredibly effective. Like I can play my unplugged acoustic violin in a purpose designed acoustic space with zero amplification and be heard in the back of a 1,500 seat hall, which just doesn't even seem possible. It seems like magic. But that's about where we max out. If we're going to go larger than 1,500 seats, we got to start messing around with some 20th century amplification, some microphones and some speakers and things like that. And even with the best person at the soundboard, there's going to be some compromises in tone quality. I mean, I've played Hollywood Bowl, that's what, 8,000 seats or something, and you still get a gorgeous classical sound, but it's a little different than playing in Disney Hall and having no microphones and speakers. So, um, anyway, the acoustic violin, because it has an acoustic sound box, it'd be like miking an acoustic guitar versus a solid body electric guitar. We're all familiar with those. And bowed stringed instruments wanted to have that unlimited capacity to be as loud as we wanted with no danger of feedback and other issues that exist when you're amplifying something that also has an acoustic sound box. So if it's going, just right out of the pickup, then it is a lot more controllable. And so an electric violin, basically that beautiful, curvy violin shape that has often been compared to the body of a woman and all of that silliness, that acoustic violin shape is our amplifier, our speaker system. It's all of that. And so if you aren't using it as that, you don't need it. So in electric violin, they're often just the fingerboard and of course, something to keep it on your body. Now, I love the kind that you don't have to hold with your jaw. They call it a chin rest in violin, but it's not really your chin. It's actually kind of the side of your face. Really it's a jaw rest, but that doesn't sound as I don't know, that sounds weird. We call it a chin rest. So anyway, because I will often play some of the more extreme genres of heavy metal on my electric violin, as opposed to any of the other things you could do on a Celtic or country or pop or whatever. With metal, you're going to want to headbang. You're going to want to, violently, move your head to the beat. And that is a little awkward if you're simultaneously holding your instrument with your head. So there are strap-on systems that where a kind of guitar strap kind of thing goes from, it hooks on to the base of the violin and then goes under your arm and around the other side. And then there's kind of a foot that's almost like a tripod kind of thing that sticks out from the back of the violin that sits on your body so that you have a 3-point system that kind of holds the instrument on there. Actually, sometimes people who have no desire to play electric violin will use one of these strap-on headless violins when they have, maybe some kind of a physical injury that they're recovering from, so that they can continue to practice while their body heals and then go back to their usual violin. But anyway, so then because it's not wood and the varnish doesn't have any resonating properties, because it's not the sound box, you can also have the ability to decorate with a paint job, like it's a car or something. You can decorate your violin in different ways. And people, I mean, it's amazing the creativity that people have come up with. Mine is black with red flames, but not those typical like cheesy red 80s flames. They're more like spiky flames. I don't know. They look really cool. And then I have extra strings. So not just the four of the violin, but one string lower to be a viola string, and then one string lower than that to be some of the cello notes. And so I can, really have that wider range. And therefore the box that holds the pegs is kind of shaped more like an electric guitar, just a little triangular sort of thing. And the pegs stick in from the top rather than the side. So it really does look a little bit like a baby flying V guitar, if you don't look too carefully. But of course, it's played like a violin with the bow. And yeah, it's just a lot of fun to be loud. And instead of 1,500 seats, you can jam in front of 15,000 seats and be heard by everyone.
That is fascinating. Just wow. And your description of that was excellent. I totally have a mental image in my head, especially of yours with your your black um electric violin with the flames, not the cheesy ones, but the cool ones. So, I got it all. Wow, that's super, super cool. And I've got to get my hands on one of these one day and check it out in person. Um, all right, just one last question for you. I know I've got to let you go here soon. Just any upcoming projects, or maybe if you have a ton, I know you stay busy. If you have a ton of them, maybe just your top two. And where can our listeners find you on social media? Because I know that they're going to want to keep up with you.
Yeah, so I have more than 40 albums out, and there's one big Spotify playlist where every single album and even a couple of guest tracks, like everything is in one single playlist. But you can also peruse all my albums on my website. And then my tour dates are on there, and it's just, different city or country every week, playing different repertoire. Every week is different. I love the variety. Next week, I'm going to be going to the National Music Museum, playing, which is very unusual, not my own violin that I practice on every day, but an instrument that lives at the museum, which is one of the most pristine existing remaining instruments by Bach's favorite instrument maker named Steiner. And so I'm going to actually do an all Bach concert on this violin, and we can really hear the voice of the maker that Bach loved with his music being played on it. So I'm going to go a couple days early and get to know that instrument and then play the concert and then play a concerto with the orchestra in town a couple days later. And yeah, it's just, constant fun everywhere I go. Um, and yeah, I just love sharing music with people. And actually, I guess most of the concerts I have coming up are, sort of what you would expect to see on my tour dates, different recitals, different concertos with orchestra, which is how I met Leslie when she was in the cello section of one of the orchestras I was soloing with. Um, but actually, one of the concerts I just did last month was a very, very, very unusual one. Um, I was hired to well, they called it a speech, but obviously I wasn't going to talk the whole time, to give a lecture at the national meeting or conference, I guess, national conference of the American Academy of Ophthalmology. And those are, of course, eye surgeons. And so I thought, what am I going to talk about and play for eye surgeons? Such a unique challenge. I love, doing things I've never done before. That's what keeps life interesting. So I talked about the fact that one of the ways that one can define classical music is as a written art form. And what does that mean? That, of course, a lot of music we play it memorized, but we learn it from the page because a lot of times the music is is complex enough that only a few rare individuals could ever learn completely by ear. And that's not to say that it's, superior to other musics. Our world, has room in it for so many different means of human expression. And I love that there's countless different kinds of music that exist. But for classical, the way that it's constructed, a lot of times you do need to learn it from the page. And, thank goodness for Braille music. But also the way that it's written in, of course, there have been blind composers like Rodrigo, whose solo violin piece I actually recorded on my Capriccio Latino album. And thinking of the fact that he had written this really amazing, intricate piece. Somehow in his head was mind blowing. And, most composers, I suppose, have the luxury of not having to do that. But kind of like writing a novel as opposed to extemporaneous or learned storytelling. When you write a novel, you revise, revise, revise. And so for classical, it's that same way with the written composition. And so a good analogy is like a Beatles album. The source is the album, and any sheet music of their songs is an approximation of the source, which is the recorded track. And classical is the opposite. A Beethoven symphony, the source is the score, and then any one night's performance of it is an approximation of the score. Not that we would sit there and read the score, it's not like a novel. You can read, a novel in your head, but with music, you have to hear it to truly experience it. So it's not an exact analogy, but it's interesting that when it comes to sight, I actually have a very unusual thing that my optometrist, the normal, not the eye surgeon, ophthalmologist, but the optometrist has to deal with because they're used to um, two different distances. There's near vision, which you need if you're going to like read your phone or something, and there's far vision that you need if you're driving. I actually need neither of those to be perfect. I need the music stand to be perfect, which is kind of sort of maybe halfway in between those two distances. So she literally, when I'm going to come in, she has to like move her equipment and remember how she did things the last time and like measure me for the special musician distance. And so many of my musician friends talk about the same thing, that they drive their eye doctors crazy because we have to be the crispest at this one particular distance, which is like a yard away from ourselves, which is neither near nor far. Um, and so, anyways, that I also, for the first time ever, performed the Beethoven Eyeglasses duo for, well, it was actually composed for viola and cello duet. And the thought is that Beethoven had two friends who both wore spectacles and played those instruments, and hence it got its nickname. He actually titles it Duet for Two Eyeglasses, which is so cute. But I arranged it for two violins so I could play it with a friend of mine for the ophthalmology conference. And then I actually ended with one of my favorite concert versions by a Black composer of a traditional spiritual, which is J. Rosamond Johnson's version of Nobody Knows the Trouble I See. That's on my album, which is called American Virtuosa Tribute to Maud Powell, because it's Maud Powell's violin version of J. Rosamond Johnson's art song version of this traditional spiritual. J. Rosamond Johnson, of course, was the composer who wrote Lift Every Voice. And I've been playing that piece a lot lately because of everything going on in our country and in our world. It seems sadly appropriate, but it also made me think about, sort of the metaphor, nobody knows the trouble I see, and that to see is probably of the five plus senses. Probably sight is the one that's used metaphorically the most when we talk about understanding as being, we like sight as a stand-in for language of understanding. And so it's such interesting timing that here I am on having the honor of being on this podcast when I was literally just kind of thinking about all of these things um, just a month ago when I played for this eye surgeon conference. So it's, yeah, really interesting how life works.
Was any of that caught on video or audio by chance? Was any of that concert streamed in any way?
Gosh, I know that um, there was an internal video made to share with, for example, the sponsor of the concert, a retired
Right.
eye surgeon who chose not to fly from California to Florida just to be there this year. So I know they got him a video, but I don't think it's anywhere on the internet publicly. But I'll definitely
Ah.
be playing that eyeglasses too. I even wore my own spectacles for the occasion, which normally I, put in my contact lenses when I'm going to play so that, when I sweat, there's no issue. But yeah, I was like, I have to do this. And it was super fun. Oh, the other thing that I played a piece by Bach. A lot of people don't realize that Bach and Handel, two of the great composers of the Baroque era, the 1700s, they were both basically killed by the same eye surgeon. There was this one guy, oh, now I'm blanking on his name, but he was one of the first people in history to ever go in for eye surgery as a specialty. But unfortunately, he wasn't very good at it. And his lack of skill in the actual practice of his profession was only matched by his above average skill in the art of advertising and marketing. So he actually traveled in a carriage covered with pictures of eyeballs. I mean, what a crazy image. And then he would go into town and set up shop, and he would perform surgery on everybody from peasants to royalty. And then he would leave town before people were healed and realized that he had botched everything. And then he would already be on at the next town. And he traveled all over Europe and kept this up for years. And despite his bad results, somehow he was really renowned and people kept coming to have these public eye surgeries from him. And sadly, both Bach and Handel were starting to have, and it's unclear what their issues might have been. Um, but the things that one does get as one ages, and they both thought, oh, here's this famous guy, let's go see if we can get fixed. And of course, not only did he not succeed in fixing their vision issues, the infections that they sustained from those bad surgeries were what led to both of their deaths. So, pretty crazy history there.
Huh. Well, I don't know what we're gonna now. You see, I thought I had a title for this episode, but I may just call it like fun. I've learned so much. There's just fun, so many fun facts. But well,
Oh, you
if
can
you
see
were,
I can
I'm
get going when it comes to historic
what?
trivia.
No, this is good. Listen, I was just gonna say, I'll have to check your tour dates to see if you're ever in Pennsylvania. I'm right here in Philly, and I would love to see you live, but also just to go to dinner and just, and just hear more of these fascinating stories about various composers. And wow, I did not know that. Well, now I just may think of a very funny title related to the deaths of these two very famous
Oh
composers
dear.
due to death by eye surgery, huh? Anywho, but this has been a real pleasure, getting to know you, getting to hear more about your story, um, and to learn the history of the violin of these composers, so on and so forth. I do look forward to meeting you in person one day. But in the meantime, thank you so much for being on the show.
Well, thanks for having me. And I really look forward to staying in touch and just, learning from you, like what I can do to help the cause. And, as I've learned, somebody working in the realm of, you know, um, classical music advocacy in, the space of, well, I guess you would call it like race and ethnicity, but specifically
Hmm.
for support and inclusion of African American youth, and then also just other things that tend to come up with people of different income levels and stuff like that. I've learned that it's particularly important to have people fighting for things that are not necessarily in that category themselves. um, in fact, when I was about to record my 97 album, with the 18th and 19th century concertos by Black composers, my record company said, does this make sense since you yourself aren't Black? And I said, well, I'm not Russian and I play the Tchaikovsky violin concerto like all the time. Um, like, I think it's actually really powerful to say this is such great music that it's music for everybody, that can be heard by everybody, played by everybody. There's an inclusiveness to music making
Yeah.
that I
Yeah.
think,
And to get it out there is so important too.
yeah, the music, there's, one of the things I love about music is that, you know, um, other kinds of music, there's issues of appropriation and appropriateness, and is it celebration or is it appropriation, and just trying to
Hmm.
navigate those things. But classical music always, since its inception hundreds of years ago, has always been about learning from each other, about collaboration, and you
Yeah.
know you know Mozart doesn't just want to be played by German and Austrian performers. They want everybody on the planet,
Oh,
you know,
yeah.
discover the music of everybody on the planet. And I love the fact that I'm in classical because bringing that value that we've always had in classical, but truly living it, to say, hey, we need to. Kind of consciously and conscientiously welcome people of a variety of disabilities to be,
Oh, yeah.
truly, um, making classical everything it can be.
So important. It's so important to do that. And thank you for doing that work and for sharing it here on the podcast. We appreciate you so much for that.
All right. Well, I look forward to continuing to listen to your podcast.
Thank you. We're always glad, always glad. And please do share us with your network. And to our listeners, stay tuned for that bonus episode I promised with Leslie Hamrick coming up now. We've got the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division's own Leslie Hamrick with us. Hey, Leslie, welcome back to the show.
Hi, it's good to be here.
And of course, as mentioned earlier in this episode, you can find Leslie's full episode in our December 2021 um, airing. So, we are going to jump right into your work with Rachel. Leslie, she mentioned that you all met in an orchestra. What do you remember about that interaction?
So that was actually the third time we met. I first met Rachel in 1996 over the summer when she played the Brahms Double Concerto with the Chicago Youth Symphony Orchestra, and her cellist that she played with was Wendy Warner. So that was when I met her for the very first time. And then I met her for the very second time in 2019 at Tanya Carey's special concert to celebrate her 80th birthday. And Rachel played and I played, so we actually got to hear each other play, which was pretty cool. And then the third time I met Rachel was actually in 2024. Yeah, 2024 at an Elmhurst Symphony rehearsal because she played the Brahms Violin Concerto with the orchestra. So I got to meet her between one of their rehearsals and a master class. And then I watched her give a master class, and it was amazing, absolutely amazing. And then I had Omega with me that day. So after that master class, she wanted to know, she said to me, who's this beautiful animal? And I said, that's my guide dog, Omega. And we just had a lovely conversation. And then I got to hear her play her concerto the next day, and then we got to talk a little bit again. And then I joined her on Facebook and been listening to whatever appearances I can that she makes. And the last one was on WFMT, where she was with her daughter, and they were talking about how they play duets and stuff, and how her daughter composed songs or a song for them to play.
Wow, thank you for mentioning that. We actually didn't get to touch on her work with her daughter in the episode. So that's what, that's the beauty of bonus tracks, right? So speaking of projects, so she's got the project with her daughter, of course, as you mentioned, but you all collaborated on a project, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes, I was featured on her Accessibility Spotlight in 2024, and that was fun because I was interviewed about like my disability and how I played in orchestra and all that good stuff. So I got to do my sales pitch of how I do it, and it was, I'm trying to remember now. I honestly can't remember. I remember being asked questions, but I can't remember if it was audio or if it was written questions. But whatever it was fun. And I think it's really awesome that Rachel does the accessibility spotlights because it gets the word out that hey, even though you're blind, you can do this, and here's how. And even though, like, I think she focuses on various disabilities when the accessibility spotlight comes out. So it's a really neat thing that you're doing, Rachel. And so keep up the good work.
It really does sound cool. Yeah, she mentioned that she has people with various disabilities. You know, I won't run down the list right now just because everyone's just heard it since these are going to come out on the same episode. Um, but it really does sound fascinating. So, would you be able to give our audience just a quick update on what you're doing musically these days, Leslie? And then, of course, your social media as well, so that people can keep up with you.
I am still teaching Braille music, of course. I do not have any cello students at the moment, but I am open to accepting other cello students. Um, I think that has changed since the pandemic because a lot of people like to study online, which I completely understand. However, for online is difficult, especially if I'm teaching a beginner, because I need hands-on and I need hands-on feedback and I need to be able to feel what a student is doing, how they're sitting, how they're positioned at the cello. And I would otherwise have to get a sighted assistant in the lesson with me, and that's hard to come by. So my thing is I will teach online if the student is at least at an intermediate level, because it can work. It just depends on the student and how honest they are with me. If I say, is your hand flat? Is your left hand flat? They have to be honest about it and tell me yes. Like if there's an intonation issue, it's usually a low elbow, low left elbow, or that the bass knuckles are collapsing in instead of being rounded. Because you want a rounded hand instead of a flat hand when you play cello.
Mm-hmm.
And I can hear a straight bow, but I can't feel their elbow and tell if it's too high or too low. So I can't feel if their feet are going all over the place and they need to keep their feet in position. So they have to at least have at least knowledge of first position, maybe a little second position, depending how to create a good sound with the bow, how to finger the cello so they're getting clear notes. And I just think that it's so important. But like I said, I had teenage student that it worked really well with. I haven't had anybody since, but of course, I'm very open to anybody who would like to give it a try.
Alrighty. So, intermediate cellists, do reach out. And where can they find you, Leslie?
You can find me on Facebook and Instagram. You can, of course, reach me at my email address of lhamrick930 at comcast.net. That's LHAMRIC 930 at comcast.net.
Alrighty. Well, that concludes our bonus track. And this has been another episode of Scene Change.
I'm Caitlin McIntyre, President of the National Federation of the Blind Performing Arts Division. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Scene Change. If you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit our website at nfb-pad.org. There you'll find links to our social media, membership, and resources for blind performers. Thanks to everyone who makes this show happen. Scene Change is executive produced by Shane Lowe, Caitlin McIntyre, and Lizzie Muhammad Park, with audio production by Drew Mochak. Also on the team are Maddie Hendricks, Aaron Jordan, and Melissa Sprouse, with music by Ryan Strunk and Tom Page. Remember, you can be the performer you want. Blindness is not what holds you back. We'll see you next time.